Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today I am here with Dr. Andrew Hartman, who is Associate Professor of History at Illinois State University still, I think.
Oh, I actually am full professor, but you
Full
can just call me
professor,
Andrew.
okay. All right, I was making sure I'm getting my right medieval nomenclature correct.
Yeah.
An author of two prior books, Education in the Cold War and The War for the Soul of America, but you're currently working on a book on Marx in America. And that's a pretty broad topic, and one that I think is understood. I first came across you because your podcast was suggested to me by a friend of mine, but also you wrote on Christopher Lasch, and I have been doing a long research project on figuring out that man's thought and what influenced that man's thought. And what I find interesting from Lasch, whether or not we agree with Lasch's interpretation of the American left, is there's actually not a lot of good histories of the broad spectrum of the U.S. left that isn't like a history of, say, the Democratic Party or the Populist Party or the Socialist Party of America or whatever. And so, why do you think that is? And then we can get to your Marx in America project.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I halfway agree with your assessment of the historiography of the American left. For many, many decades, it was really strong. And so in researching this book on Marx in America, I've read it all when it comes to the history of the American left, and stuff written between the 1930s and probably the 1970s or 80s was really strong. There was a lot of it, a heavy focus on labor and the left's relationship to labor. And yes, there's been somewhat of a decline in that, in the study of the American left by American historians since then. I think that charts or tracks alongside the decline of the left itself. And so instead of more and more excellent histories of, say, the American Socialist Party, the American Communist Party, the pre-Socialist Party, 19th century left, etc. You get a lot of studies about the Black left. There's a strong recent historiography of the Black left, which isn't always left, but sometimes is left. You get a lot of studies about the sort of like the left's relationship to issues of gender, and then but you get far more sort of focused studies on really Democratic Party politics, and what goes for, I guess, quote unquote social democracy in the US, that is the New Deal. So I agree with that assessment. But if you go back, like for example, Philip Foner, Communist Party member and historian who worked really from the 1940s through the end of his life in the 1980s. He wrote like 20 books on the American left. I've read most of them in my research, and they're excellent, like finely grained studies of particular moments of the American left, particular groups, particular people. So if you look, it's there, but I think there's definitely we're in a time where I think there could be a lot more done. And so if you're a fledgling young historian, go study the American left. There's a lot of ground there to till.
Yeah, one thing I would say, I should have caveated that since 1970, because I feel like it's through this Lasch project that I've been reading a lot of the books that you're talking about, that I'm like, oh, this history was great. It's written in 1955.
Yeah.
What I find interesting about the contemporary moment is once you see a rebirth of, quote, Marxism, unquote, after 2007, there is a rebirth in the history of the left, but it's largely in the history of the European left between World War II and, say, 1970, 1980. Not a real exploration of our own history at all. There are exceptions to that. I think the other thing I may add is, like, there are some during this time period that we're talking about, the kind of dry period. There are like sectarian histories of the left. So like there's like, kind of a Tony Cliffite history of Trotskyism and this and the other.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them are okay. I mean, as long as you know their sectarian bias and you read for it, they're fine, right? And that's going to be true of anything. You have to read for bias. But why do you think the immediate turn was to the European left in the aughts and early aught teens, and not to any of our own history here in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think this is there's a long causal explanation at work here that goes all the way back to Werner Sombart, the German sociologist's question that he raised in an article and then a book, Why No Socialism in the United States. I think there's a long and deeply embedded assumption that is global, that European leftists in particular have, and that I think a lot of American leftists have sort of inherited, and that is that there really isn't an American left, at least not one to speak of, not a history. And so if we're looking for, say, a usable past, lots of people would rather turn elsewhere, the European left being the most sort of like relevant example because a much more robust left did indeed develop, or at least a more organized party-based left developed in Europe than in comparison with the United States. And so I guess, I guess the obvious explanation has to do with that. But I also think that, so people who would consider themselves on the left in the United States, when they're looking for recent success in history, they're going to look to things like the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and to some degree, they're going to look for the ways in which these movements might have helped shape certain Democratic Party priorities. And so I think, a focus on, say, well, what's happened to the Democratic Socialists of America since its formation in the early 1980s, or a focus on like the Communist Party of America after Stalin, after Khrushchev's revelations in 1956. There have been lots of American leftist parties. There's still a history there, even if it's diminished, but it's been largely ignored for sure.
Yeah, I find that to be a lot of the case, and I find it even to be the case, for example, when there's been history and historiography around, say, new left figures, that their relation to sectarian or party left groups are largely left out or not fully explored. And so that's quite interesting. But this is a somewhat separate question, though, than the title of your book. This is not the left in America, which is a huge, unwieldy thing. This is Marx in America, which is also huge and unwieldy, but it somewhat more limited. So one of the things I think it surprises people when they study Marx and when you get past the basics is how much he was actually concerned with U.S. politics, and how important he thought it was going to be in the global development of capitalism. And I think that's underexplored. And I also think like there are debates between Marx and other socialists. I think, for example, Henry George, that are not often even dealt with in like general Marxist historiography. So would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Because I do deal with all of that in my book. So my book is actually it's a history of how Americans have read about, thought about, and acted on Marx's ideas from essentially the U.S. Civil War up until the present. And it includes a lot of left wing and labor history, but it also includes history of liberals and conservatives and reactionaries and government figures who have read Marx, thought about Marx, used Marx in various ways. But that said, the first chapter, which is the lengthy first chapter, is about how Karl Marx thought about the United States. And he did indeed think about the United States throughout much of his life. Now, his attention to the United States ebbed and flowed. Most famously, he was gravely concerned with events in the United States during the early parts of the Civil War, and he wrote extensively about the United States Civil War, especially in 1860 and 61. Those writings are collected in several different books, but my favorite is the recently collected edition edited by Andrew Zimmerman and put out by International Publishers. It's a great read, and you can learn a lot about Marxist thought and the ways in which he developed his thinking about capitalism in tandem with his attention to the United States. And so, for example, there are large sections of Capital Volume 1 in which it seems to me, and many others have agreed with me, that there's like a direct causal link between his attitude towards, for example, the working day. That's kind of my favorite section of Capital Volume 1, and what close attention he paid to the Civil War, to slavery, and the role of slavery in terms of the Civil War, and especially the role of enslaved Blacks sort of liberating themselves. It's really a quite fascinating and I think understudied history. But Marx's understanding of things like capitalism and democracy in tandem with his attention to the United States goes back even further than that. One of his early famous essays on the Jewish question really is about political democracy and its limitations in the context of a capitalist economy and society. And he largely sort of formed his ideas about that essay by reading these several travelogues, which were written by Europeans who had come to the United States and written about the United States. Most famously, of course, Democracy in America by Tocqueville, but some of the other ones that were widely read by Europeans as well. And so a lot of Marx had sort of ambiguous, sometimes contradictory ideas about the United States, and his mind changed quite a bit. At times he thought, well, because of political democracy, which by the time he was writing was universal for white men at least, he thought that maybe socialism could be brought to the United States peacefully through the ballot. And he looked, for example, at the Working Men's Party in the United States, which formed in 1829 and 1830 in Philadelphia and New York City, as an example of that possibility. But then, of course, there were other times in which he thought that American democracy was a sham, a cover for American capitalism. And so, people oftentimes want to talk about Marx was for revolution, against reform, or some social democrats might argue the opposite. When you look at his writings on the United States and the way in which his thoughts about capitalism developed alongside his attention to the United States, you come, I think, from my perspective, to realize that for him, reform and revolution were not diametric opposites. So, for example, he could often be in support of shorter working days and would recognize that such legislation in the US, which happened after the Civil War, and then also in the UK, which happened about the same time, that was a result of class struggle, a very clear result of class struggle. But it wasn't an end in and of itself. It was a means for furthering socialist consciousness development towards the revolution.
I think that court of schism, I mean, this is more clear in, the debates around Engels on this, and then Engels' assumption that universal male suffrage would lead to proletarian electoral power, although there are some caveats in that letter, and some caveats that unfortunately when Kautsky reprinted it, he cut out. Yeah. But it's interesting to see that in Marx himself. I also find it interesting how much journalism Marx did for a German-speaking American audience. It actually makes it kind of hard to figure out what some things are Marx's, because a lot of the journalism was roughly uncredited. I know, for example, a lot of Americans who attribute Marx of being a rabid anti-Semite will find stuff published in the same newspaper and misattribute it to him because articles were unsigned. But when you read it, and even in translation, it does not read like the same man at all. I've read enough Marx in translation to have a pretty good feel for how it translates if you're being remotely accurate, and it doesn't read the same. But why was that so much of his? I think people like forget how much of his livelihood was tied up in these newspapers, and why was he writing for an American audience so much? Particularly, I think it was during the 1850s. But
yeah. And it wasn't just for a German American audience. He was writing in English for the New York Tribune throughout much of the 1850s. And the New York Tribune during the 1850s was the most widely read newspaper in the world. It had over 200,000 subscribers, about twice as many as at the time were subscribing to the London Times. And it was mostly read by people in the orbit of the Republican Party, so the newly formed Republican Party. And so, like, after the Marx, as you and your listeners, I'm sure know, wrote a lot during the European revolutions of 1848. And Charles Dana, who was one of the editors of the New York Tribune, an abolitionist, an American Republican, he had read some of these, and he actually traveled to Europe to recruit Marx to write for the New York Tribune. Marx was sent into exile and had some trouble sort of gaining economic and political security in the years after 1848. But by 1851, when he had kind of settled in London, he then began writing for the New York Tribune. And mostly he did so because he needed the money. I mean, he was in deep poverty at the time, and this was the only steady income he had throughout the 1850s, other than funds from his comrade Engels. And so that was the main reason he did it. But he became like probably the single most important European correspondent for the New York Tribune. And during the 1850s, he wrote over 500 or published over 500 articles. Now, these were mostly published without a byline. And in fact, of the 500, historians who have really pored over these things estimate, based upon style, that Engels probably wrote about 100 to 150 of them, was helping him out, especially early on, because when he first started writing for the New York Tribune, Marx wasn't very fluent in English, but he developed that fluency over the course of the 1850s, such that by the end, he was writing most of these articles on his own in English, and really covering a wide array of topics, mostly European topics for an American readership.
So, I've recently interviewed some people who are interested in Marxist journalism, and I think it's a category of Marxist writing that's often, dropped. We talk about the published theoretical writings, the unpublished theoretical writings, i.e., most of them, the polemical writings in Europe, like the Brumaire and whatnot. And then there's the category of journalism, which I do think is often just not studied that well by Marx, because there's a lot of bad arguments, for example, made about, say, the Civil War in Marxist thought. Now, Marx is not consistent in whether or not he thinks like the U.S. South is capitalist or not, for example. Like, it's actually, I've read it that he contradicts himself, but there's a whole lot of his thought that are clarified if you read the journalism, and not as much in the theoretical writings, because it's there, like you said. There's indications that it affected things in capital, but it's not directly stated at all.
Yeah, I think that's right. To me, here's the connection you can make between the journalism and his more famous theoretical writings. Even in the theoretical writings, there's a lot of empirical detail. He pays a great deal of attention to trying to get the facts right, even as he makes pretty bold, sometimes abstract theoretical enunciations. And I think that is, it's a holdover, or it's a part of his journalistic background. He spent as much or more of his life as a writer as a journalist than as a political economist or whatever we want to call him, a philosopher. And so this great attention to detail, but also in his journalism, he brought a historical materialism that he's most famous for, in that in his journalism, he almost always sort of rooted the analysis of politics or the analysis of events in these larger structures that we've come to associate with Marx. And you can really get a sense of that. And so, like, some of my favorite pieces of Marx writing, I mean, I love Capital, but some of my other favorites are those that kind of mix the theoretical and the journalistic. The 18th Brumaire, of course, being the most famous. There's an attention to detail that's really important for him, an attention to the actual facts, the empirical stuff, the grubby empirical stuff. But there's also a way in which he roots the facts in larger processes. And to me, this makes Marx really sort of like a forerunner to modern historiography, because the best historians of the 20th and now the 21st century, this is what I think they or we try to do. In his the other sort of writings of his that I enjoy the most are actually his writings on the U.S. Civil War, because this is what he does. He was fired by the New York Tribune, or let go, when the Civil War started, because the Tribune decided, because of the war, they didn't have the funds to continue to pay for a European correspondent. And then he picked up some journalistic work with Die Press, which is an Austrian German language newspaper at the time. And he became, like, for a German European audience, especially on the left, the sort of go-to person to reveal to them the events of what was happening in the United States, which the whole world is paying attention to at the time because of the Civil War. And I happen to think that some of his really long essays on the U.S. Civil War, in addition to some of his correspondence with people like Engels, and then some of his comrades in the United States fighting in the Civil War, such as Joseph Wedemeyer, I happen to think that he's incredibly astute on the Civil War. He conceptualized the slave South as operating almost like, he recognized that there were sort of like non-capitalistic or feudal elements in the way in which that society was organized, but ultimately that attention to a global capitalist market was shaping and changing those feudal relations or those slave-based relations on the ground. Historians continue to this day to debate this question. Eugene Genovese, famously, even while he was still a Marxist, highly criticized Marx for being sort of what he thought was naive towards the slaveholders. Genovese always had a sometimes hidden, sometimes out in the open, unabashed love for the slaveholding class, because he believed they were sort of anti-capitalist in their sensibilities. But to me, Marx was actually fairly consistent and oftentimes correct in terms of his assessment between the relationship of Southern slavery and capitalism. And I do think that this helped shape his understanding of sort of the further development of capitalism, as seen in the publication of the first volume of Capital, which comes out in 1871. And so he really sort of quit paying attention to events in the United States as closely in 1862 or 3 to turn his attention back to completing Capital. But I feel like many of the main arguments in Capital work in tandem with his attention towards the Civil War.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Genovese. I always thought Genovese's reading of the planter class was like just taking George Fitzhugh at face value. And for those of you who don't know, George Fitzhugh was the guy who brought the word sociology into English, but was a apologist for the South, who argued that slavery was good because it was anti-capitalist, because it freed people from having to make capitalist decisions. Basically an argument for, well, feudal relations are great, and this is feudal relations. but to get back on topic, I just that side note is interesting because I think a lot of the new historiography around slavery is actually quite good on illustrating how much capital industrial development made that institution worse, and then how much real capital power that the planter class actually had, and was able to hold on to later on. But how was Marx initially received after the Civil War? I mean, there's not a whole lot of Marx. Obviously, in the 1860s, is tied up with the First International. There's a lot less writing, and then he doesn't have many productive years of writing after that. Although some of the key works come in the late 1860s, actually. But how was he received in the U.S.? One of the things I realized many years ago is when I was taught about Henry George, no one mentioned to me that he had been in correspondence with the Socialist International and it had debates with Marx. So,
yeah, that's a good question, and that's one that like a really close attention to the history and historiography has helped me answer, because there's this libertarian, I'm drawing a blank on his name, who wrote this paper recently that kind of got a lot of air on Twitter, arguing that nobody anywhere, especially in the United States, paid any attention to Marx until after the Russian Revolution of 1917. And although there's like an element of truth in the sense that Marx didn't become a world-renowned figure until the Bolshevik Revolution, it doesn't quite explain the growing attention to Marx and his writings in the United States after the Civil War. So at first, very little. Capital, for example, published in 1867, does not get translated into English until the 1880s, and it doesn't get translated for an American audience until like 1906, when Clark Kerr Company, which was a publishing arm of the Socialist Party at the time, put out a number of translations of Marx's writings, including all 3 volumes of Capital, which were translated by Ernst Untermann, this really interesting German-American guy, socialist. And so at first, really the only people in the United States after the Civil War paying attention to Marx were like the German American socialist community, especially in places like New York City and increasingly in other cities like Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis, where into the 1870s and 1880s, this socialist community is growing. Milwaukee as well, based upon German immigrants, who many of whom had fought in the 1848 revolution. They're known as the 48ers, many of whom fought in the Civil War. And some of their leaders had been friends or correspondents of Marx's. And so it's really that direct connection to begin with that allows for the slow trickling out of Marx's ideas in the United States. And so you get these like German publications in New York that are publishing some translations of Marx's works. And then in the 1870s, you get the development of the Working Men's Party of the United States. This is not to be confused with the earlier 19th century one. And they really are what I would consider the first party in the United States to organize around Marxist principles. And it's a lot of these German Americans, but they began to expand out and include some other like non-German Americans, including some Black Americans. Peter Clark in Cincinnati is kind of considered the first Black Marxist socialist in the United States. He was a member of the Working Men's Party in the United States. And then from there, you get that disbands pretty quickly. There's a lot of sectarian infighting, go figure. And then you, as usual, and then you get the development of the Socialist Labor Party, which eventually under Daniel De Leon becomes truly a Marxist party. Doesn't have tons of success in sort of gaining a huge following outside of like New York City and a few other hotspots of German American socialism. But eventually, these ideas build into the Socialist Party of America and Eugene Debs. And before you know, you have people in the early 20th century reading Marx, talking about Marx in New York, in St. Louis, in Seattle, in Oklahoma, of all places, where people would sort of mix their Marx with their readings of the Bible.
Yeah.
So well before, so Phil Magnus is the name of this libertarian. He's kind of a pretty well-known shit stir on Twitter amongst libertarians. He wrote this article and he argues nobody really paid attention to Marx until 1917, but I don't think that's true. I think there was a slow buildup such that by the time the Russian Revolution happens, there are plenty of people, mostly on the left, of course, who were extremely well aware of Marx by the Russian Revolution.
I mean, there's also a case to be made that before, say, 1890, hardly any Germans have heard of Marx either. But the gradual buildup was pretty quick. I think people do underestimate how underread Capital was. Like that text took a long time to even become super important to the Marxian end of the German socialist movement. But I find it interesting how much more engagement in the late 19th century that there was than I thought. Like, because I had, even though I'm a Marxist, I had initially thought that they were correct. That like there's the Civil War correspondence and Marxist railroad. Then there's the letter to Lincoln, and then Marx doesn't really play any important role in America till like maybe 1905, 1906. But that's just not the case.
There's also this sort of like dialectical effect between leftists who are reading and sort of trying to implement Marxist ideas through party politics, and liberals and conservatives who, in response, are growing increasingly sort of fearful of Marx. And so I argue that after the Paris Commune of 1871, you actually have the first Red Scare in the United States. Now, it's a very small one, especially compared to those that came later. But people wrongly attributed the Paris Commune to Marx. He didn't have anything whatsoever to do with it, except that he wrote one of the most famous essays about it afterwards. And after this, like some American journalists actually traveled to London to meet with Marx because they thought this is the guy, the sort of evil genius of these ideas that's going to go to war with capital. And then again, you have kind of a small but even larger Red Scare after, say, 1886, because a lot's going on at that time. You have like violent labor scuffles, Haymarket, and again, Henry George's campaign for mayor of New York City, which does surprisingly well. Now, George was not a Marxist, but his ideas were considered threatening to capital by capitalists. But to go back to your original sort of question, yes, Henry George, he didn't have tons of correspondence with Marx himself. He had some with Engels, but Marx read Progress and Poverty, George's most famous book from 1871, which was widely read, not just in the US, but also in Europe, and had some pretty critical points about it. He didn't consider it, he didn't think it was an attack on capitalism, just an attack on a particular class of capitalists.
Right. Yeah. He basically a class of land holding. And I find it interesting because Georgian socialism are its form of mutualism, which I guess is slightly different than like Prohun's, has a lot of influence on like American radicals in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's kind of completely forgotten about, except weirdly by libertarians. So like it was one of these things where every now and then you'll meet a weird like left libertarian, and by that we don't mean the left libertarians who are anarcho-communists or anarcho-socialists and won't admit it, but we mean the like libertarian capitalists who have a problem with corporations, and they'll find Henry George and say, well, capitalism isn't the problem, it's landholding. Or something like that. And, which to me indicates that Marx was probably onto something about a critique of what George was doing. But I do think people need to be reminded that that was considered dangerously radical in the United States in the late 19th century. So I think that's the interesting point that I think is fascinating is I have made an argument that there are versions of socialism that were developed in America kind of differently and separately, although often inspired by the European things. They kind of all really consolidate into what we might, into the workers' movement in the early 20th century. And I've gone back and forth on why that is. Part of me thinks that there's just so many damn red scares that push people into like a less sectarian organization just to like get by. And I always find it when we always talk about 3 red scares, and I'm like, I think there's at least 6. Like from the crushing of Reconstruction forward, there's just all kinds of fears of us, and there might even be things we might call proto red scares, like the Federalists cracking down on the Whiskey Rebellion and shit. Like there's just a whole lot of internecine class warfare and making sure the working class doesn't develop its own ideology in the United States. It's kind of been bracketed out of our history, and we only really talk about 2 of them, which I guess is the 19 teens and then the 1950s. But there's a lot more than that.
Right. I think one thing that needs to be understood when we're trying to come to terms with why the left in the United States has never been as large or organized or powerful, say, as the left in some European nations. And that is because the capitalists in the United States have always been so incredibly powerful. So like the ways in which capitalist organizations or corporations organized in the 19th century, they were larger entities. I mean, they were like transcontinental entities that operated oftentimes outside the purview of government and didn't think they needed government or any input from workers. And they, they developed so much power, so much control over so much capital, land, and wealth that this sort of inculcated an ideology amongst the capitalist class in the United States that really has never gone away, and that is that they don't need government, although they often do. They don't need help. They don't need a say from anybody. They are the ones who can decide the future of the nation. And that type of ideology, backed by actual power, has meant that the left has always had trouble getting organized in the face of that. And red scares are like a really sort of blatant or obvious manifestation of the capitalist class cracking down on the left at particular moments when it seems like there might be an upswell of anti-capitalism or an upswell of a threat to capitalist property, which happened, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, what historians call the first Red Scare, and then, of course, the less rational but more pervasive and powerful second Red Scare, McCarthyism.
Yeah, I think the influence of the Bolshevik Revolution has it's misunderstood a lot, I think, in the United States, how effective it was at getting a lot of, like, it basically is. I think it's one of the first things. It and the imprisonment of devs is what kills the SPA, makes it kind of a dormant organization for its surviving 40 years afterwards. And I think that's largely because the ferocity of which it was suppressed was unclear, and the kind of socialist adjacent liberals that did exist probably from the 1890s forward they also took a very radical anti-Bolshevik position that was not clear. One of the things I learned from both reading Christopher Lasher's book Liberals in the Russian Revolution and reading the books in the footnotes, which was actually really helpful, was that the liberal response to the Bolsheviks actually wasn't a totally foregone conclusion, that there was like kind of a proto-socialist element of classical liberalism in that would have been in the time nascent in the it was Morrison in the Republican Party, although was kind of also in the Democratic Party when the William Jennings Bryan faction of the populists went into the Democrats. But that was always kind of there, and it's the Russian Revolution that like drives those people off. You know, they either become socialist, a few do, most of them become anti-communist almost immediately. But it is interesting how that's not clear at first, because for example, like U.S. business was not happy with Tsarism, and the Tsarist threat, as part of the quote Russian threat, actually is very old, older than I realized. Like that we had discourse about the Tsar in, you know, the 19th century. I was like, we cared about that. Yeah. And I find that very interesting because it does indicate one of the major ways that Marx is, I think, read like neutral to hostilely in America, and then just outright hostilely afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the Bolshevik Revolution, it's really hard to overestimate its importance. It might be the most important event of the 20th century on a global scale. But just speaking about the U.S. and the U.S. left, you're right that it really, so sort of like socialist adjacent types, liberals who were sort of favorable to socialism, turned against largely, not right away, but by the mid to late 1920s, turned against socialism for oftentimes for fear of Bolshevik revolution. I mean, many of these people actually during the 1920s traveled to the Soviet Union sort of out of curiosity, because of what was being built there was so sort of unique. And many progressives, people like John Dewey, who believed in sort of like rational, organized, planned societies, thought maybe that's what was happening in the Soviet Union. They were usually disillusioned after their visits, or maybe after like learning about some particular aspect of the Soviet regime in the years during the 1920s, and then especially during the 1930s. But what also happened is a large socialist movement, which had sort of by World War I organized under the umbrella of the Socialist Party of America, Eugene Debs's party, splintered because a large faction, especially the sort of foreign-born or Eastern European faction, wanted to organize along communist lines, sort of connecting themselves with the newly formed Communist International, Soviet Union, and wanting to sort of work towards a revolution of the sort that had happened in 1917 in Russia. Others who probably were sort of longer standing socialists in an American context argued that was not the right move in the United States. And so the Socialist Party splinters at the exact moment when the federal government, in conjunction with state and local police forces, in conjunction with large, well-funded and organized vigilante groups, were cracking down on the left all over the country. The political repression of the first Red Scare, I don't know if enough Americans know about that. I don't know if enough people on the left are aware of how repressive it was. And the state...
it was much more violent than the second one, even though the second one's the one we understand better.
Yeah, it wasn't as culturally pervasive, perhaps, as the second one, but it was much more violent. You know, you're sending people overseas, you're imprisoning people, you're killing people, you're burning. So, like the offices of all kinds of left-wing organizations, from the Wobblies to the Socialist Labor Party to the Socialist Party, are being burned in cities like Chicago and St. Louis. It was a severe political repression. And it was very, very difficult for the left to recover from that. There is a left, a very strong and powerful and important left in the 1930s. But had the left not been almost destroyed or in the late teens and early 20s, a lot more hay could have been made by the left, I think, during the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Yeah, I do think they would have been able to be a more independent voice from, say, the New Deal Democrats than they were able to do, particularly after. I mean, there's this irony, right, in American history, whereas some of the best organization the left does is before the Popular Front, when when third periodism is dominant in Marxist-Leninist ideology, and they take up a united front from below, actually effectively endorsing something that is generally associated with Trotskyists. And then after 1936, they pivot away from that. And by the time that the U.S. enters the war, you have the full instantiation of the Popular Front, which, does end up subsuming, I think, I mean, you can disagree, but I think the work of Charlie Post also agrees with me here, that it ends up subsuming a lot of the Marxist left into the Democratic Party in a way that makes them easily purgeable, and less violently purgeable, but easily purgeable, through like the consolidation of the AFL-CIO and the booting of all the communists out of the CIO, etc., in the 1950s. But there's the flip side to that is there is a truth that the Popular Front actually does get more real power in the early instantiations than the things that they were able to do before. But it causes, like, I would say, a whole lot of contradictions, like having radical black liberationists in the same party with segregationists. Like, it, there's a bunch of contradictions there. I don't know your take on that time period, but it's just for me, it's hard to talk about because it feels like, on one hand, it's for most American leftists, is the one period of American history where there's a visible left that has an effect on the government outside of the Eugene Debs campaign and his imprisonment. And on the other hand, you can feel all the things that are used to suppress and just like completely remove the American left, out from any power at all in the 1950s being built up at the same time.
Yeah, it's a perplexing history. And, if you're a leftist or a communist organizer in the 1930s, your options weren't great. There's never been a time in American history when leftists had good options. That's part of the problem, right? Or maybe that's the single biggest problem.
Maybe the problem.
The left finally is sort of organizing, and it's deeply embedded in the labor movement. It has these successes with like sit-down strikes, and it's there is like something approaching class warfare that's going in the direction of the left in the 1933, 34, especially 35. And it gets co-opted by a Democratic Party that was much more amenable to working class interests than it ever had been before, probably since as well. And by a president who recognized that both the vast majority of Americans were suffering, working people were suffering, and that their suffering, this mass suffering, was a threat to the system, the political and economic system, American democracy, or whatever you want to call it, and capitalism. So the New Deal is contradictory in this sense, in that it both saves capitalism, saves the American political system from what most people would consider a worse alternative, probably fascism. But it also it also makes the lives better of a lot of working people, just enough so that it really sort of like makes the left less necessary in the eyes of lots of workers. And so you especially see this. What's so, I think, contradictory, ironic, perplexing about the second Red Scare, the McCarthyist era, is that this extreme political repression that is widespread for like 7 to 10 years is almost unnecessary, given the fact that the majority of American workers in this post-war era start to experience some degrees of prosperity that they had never before experienced, that they didn't expect to experience, due to the New Deal, the social welfare state, and it's being wrapped up in the American empire, which at that point was controlling most of the planet, aside from the communist bloc. But I think one way to understand the Red Scare, this McCarthyist Red Scare, and all Red Scares, but in particular this one, early on after World War II, the labor movement is still sort of organizing to have some say or some control over the workplace. And that's the thing that the capitalist class in the United States cannot abide. And so they make concessions to the working class in terms of wages and benefits, but the unions make concessions twofold at least, and that is they give up control over the workplace. They're not going to have any sort of say over management, and also they're going to get rid of their communists, those people who probably would not go along with giving up control over the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I mean, the one advantage communists had in America is they were really good labor organizers.
The best.
I mean, you know, it led to some weird things like William C. Foster, everyone's favorite Marxist-Leninist, who's also a syndicalist, which is something that's really hard to square. But they were really good, and they had gotten good over, I mean, and some of the people over the course of 50 years. And the irony is, you know, after John Lewis is gone and they purged the communists of the CIO, there really aren't good organizers left, and they don't need to be, because that social compact makes it seem like they're a third leg of the American state, a weaker leg, and you know, this is
until they're not needed anymore.
Exactly. Like, well, until there's a profitability crisis, and also, you know, we can figure out how to do this without you, and you're expensive.
Speaking of the importance of the Bolshevik Revolution of the 20th century, I think it's also important to note at this point, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, the Soviet Union is still incredible, and the communist bloc in general is still an incredibly powerful foe to the United States and the capitalist system control that's sort of led by the United States. And there's a sense that pleasing workers in the West is going to, or placating workers in the West is going to allow the United States to sort of wage the Cold War and continue to attempt to foster capitalist development around the world. That all goes away as the Soviet Union begins to decline, and as you said, there's a profitability crisis in the 1970s.
Yeah, and then to add a cherry on top, the Sino-Soviet split completely and totally finalizes. So it's like, you know, it's been going on since the mid 50s, but it's a hard break by the 70s. You have stuff like, you know, Mao's government being nice to Pinochet just to spite the Soviets.
Yeah.
And I always like to bring that up because it's a super complicated thing. Now we should probably go back to Marx in America. How were the conservatives reading Marx in this time period, particularly in the mid 20th century? And then maybe how liberals were, like, what were the dominant liberal readings of Marx and dominant conservative readings of Marx, other than the normal Marx is the devil stuff that's always been with us? But
so in the from like 1940 up until 1960, almost every significant, well-known liberal intellectuals in the United States wrote about Marx to some degree. And what I argue is they used Marx as a framework as an antithesis to their development of what they began to call the American political tradition. So it's really in this time period in the early Cold War when an American political tradition is invented, and it's invented against Marxism. It's a system that for them makes Marx irrelevant because, and really here they're sort of premising their notions on the successes of the New Deal. The working class, they argue, had against the grain of Marx's notion of like immiseration, had never anywhere in world history been as prosperous as it was in the American in the West, but in particular in the United States in this time period. And this really sort of allows them to develop their argument for an American political tradition that's about pluralism. And so they use Marx as, I guess, as a straw man in making the case and sort of developing what they consider an American political tradition. And you can see this in the writings of people as varied, well, maybe not varied, in some ways varied, but Edmund Wilson, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Walt Rostow, the list goes on. All of the famous ones were writing about Marx in this time period. And in fact, this notion of an American political tradition that is pluralistic and technocratic really seeps into how the government and politicians are seeing themselves during this time period, from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy and beyond. Conservatives at the very same moment are reading Marx differently because their assumption is that American liberalism, as represented by the New Deal order, is Marxist.
Right.
And so they're reading Marx as a way to counter American liberalism. And in those readings, you get some really interesting takes from both libertarians like Hayek and Friedman, but also from more what you might call traditionalists or religious conservatives, a Southern agrarian like James Weaver, for example, a William F. Buckley Jr., who was kind of both a libertarian and a traditionalist. You get some really interesting analyses of Marx from someone like Whittaker Chambers. And so the fascinating thing to me is that in this era, this post-war era, when the left was crushed, liberals and conservatives, all of whom were responsible for crushing the left, are turning to Marx as a way to explain what's right or what's wrong about the United States in this time period.
Right. I think the 1950s is hard for people to grasp because conservatism in America is not what it yet is. I mean, like Buckley is coming up. The Birchers they exist. There's definitely still neo-Confederates around and stuff like that. But when I always talk about the 50s, I'm like, yeah, but the Republican Party under Eisenhower is still largely a liberal institution. Like, you have not had the full purging of, and I'm going to say it with a caveat, with American conservatism is still broadly speaking liberal, but which confuses the shit out of everybody. But the consolidation of the conservative wing of liberalism in the GOP did not really happen until the end of the Nixon administration. But you get these wild readings of Marx that also start what I like to call blaming the problems of liberalism on Marxist. And that's like when you start getting your fun, when there's a cleanup of, like, say, the fascist conspiracies about Judeo-Bolshevism into cultural Marxism and and what people are complaining about with cultural Marxism is the American liberal tradition, then the counterculture, and then I don't know, like some of the more culturally progressive wings of capitalism, even as we see now, where somehow we're back to like when the fascists are blaming, both communism and capitalism on the Jews. We are gotten to where somehow like contemporary capitalism and like Disney's decisions are a manifestation of Marxism from this tradition. But this really does begin in the late 50s in these kind of conservative dissident areas. It really comes up during Goldwater. And I think Rick Perlstein, a liberal, not a good socialist, but actually does document pretty well that like this is actually the political milieu of the baby boomers and etc. So that's standard. And what I find interesting, Andrew, is when I encounter even quote leftists who are over 45, I happen to be very close to that age, so I feel it. But when
I'm 50, so
yeah, but yeah, your cohort, Gen Xers, most of them actually repeat to me the liberal assertions of the 1950s liberals, like as truths. Like Marxism was discredited, but they have the fall of the Soviet Union to help them out in that argument. But what they argue is basically like Marx is irrelevant because of the Soviet Union proved that the Marxist experiment was invalid. And he's not a bad guy like the conservatives say, but he's not our tradition. We value pluralism and democracy and technocracy and professional politics, things that a 3-year-old will point out are contradictory. But that is actually of even of leftists of a certain age, a kind of standard response. You know, I mean, anarchists who throw that stuff at me sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to note that this really is kind of, I mean, I think Christopher Lasch writes about it pretty well when he talks about the Congress of Cultural Freedom. This was an active project, like, to create an American tradition where there wasn't one. I mean, I think a lot of people just don't know how much of traditional Americana is invented whole cloth in the 50s anyway. Even stuff like the way we think about Thanksgiving is a product of the 1950s. And this kind of invented traditionalism is assumed in the liberal half. And while it's easy to counter, you know, some of the crazier readings of conservatives who like think that, I don't know, somehow JFK was a secret Marxist and LBJ was a secret Marxist. And maybe actually they said this, Eisenhower was a secret Marxist. That conflation is still hard for some people to separate. And I also think even some Marxists understand Marxism through these misunderstandings.
I think that's right. So one of the main reasons I am writing this book, and it's almost done, so hopefully everyone will have a big, thick copy in their hands in a year or so, is to persuade people, hopefully convince people that Marx is has always been incredibly relevant to American history, both because Americans have read and thought about Marx in sort of forming our ideas about our society, but also because the things Marx wrote have always and should continue to speak to us. And not in these sort of like propagandistic, simplistic ways in which people argue that, you know, like Marx, there was a direct line from Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto to the Gulag. That's definitely one of my goals. Like, to me, one of the reasons why Marx has always spoken to many Americans, not obviously not as many as I would like, but many Americans, is because he offered a perspective on freedom that was missing from a lot of American discourse at any given period, and certainly missing from the social lives of Americans. And that is, for Marx, you can't really begin to conceptualize freedom in any serious sense. And this goes all the way back to his writings from the early 1840s on democracy and alienation. So we can't begin to think about freedom unless we have freedom over our labor. We have labor autonomy. We have freedom at the workplace. And so, like, in the United States now, perhaps more than ever, as much as ever, and more than most other places in the world, we work long hours, often in shitty conditions, often with very little autonomy. And so, in a nation that pretends to care about freedom as one of its founding principles and one of its animating principles, well, we should care about freedom when we're working. And none of, like, the American political tradition as defined by liberals didn't give a fuck about that. Conservatives, of course, have never. In fact, libertarianism is a contradiction in its title because it actually is interested in the liberty of people to be enslaved in the workplace.
Right.
So to
It's
me,
funny when people like Herman Hoppe make it explicit, like,
yeah,
feudal serf relations is good because it's the ultimate manifestation of capitalism. I'm like, well, it's not actually, but you're letting what you like about this be known. Like,
so Marx still speaks to this aspect. I mean, there's many other elements of Marx that I think are still relevant. But this particular aspect of Marxism, which you can see so poignantly in the section of Capital on the Working Day, that I think will continue to live on as long as there's capitalism. And let's face it, in the United States, there's still capitalism. So I think we should still be reading and talking about Marx and Marxists and, thinking about ways to organize a different, better future. And Marx is one person we could look to for that.
Okay. I think that's kind of a great summation. We'll come back when the book is finished and I can talk about like specific chapters and whatnot. So I'll have you back on. I wanted to ask you about your take on the last decade. You're one of, I'm discovering there are more of us now than there used to be, but I like to say the vanishingly few Gen X leftist of any kind of consistency. Which is to say there are lots of people who identified as left wing as in our generation, or I guess my weird sub generation, which is like borderline. I'm 42, but it was ad hoc. Like, and when you met leftists, it was usually about specific events and causes. There was not like a driving analysis. Usually, at best, you got Chomsky. But as someone who's kind of seen this, we're not part of the new left. We're too young for that. And this new kind of, I'm hesitant to call it a millennial left, but this rebirth of left after 2007. How do you feel like it's going under the Biden administration?
Yeah, this is because I'm actually writing the last chapter of my book, which is about how Americans have received and thought about Marx really since the year 2000. About the time when I started reading Marx, maybe a little, I probably started reading Marx in the late 1990s. I think you're exactly right to describe the sort of Gen X left of the 80s and 90s. I once described it in a review of a book as the whack-a-mole left. Like, oh, here we care about like the repression of the Zapatistas. We'll try and sort of whack that mole, or we care about, like the WTO. Let's whack that mole. And I think most people of my generation who were on the left were reading Howard Zinn. We were reading Noam Chomsky. But there wasn't necessarily a sort of sense of history, and there wasn't necessarily a sense of like a Marxist organizing principle. I was encouraged after 2007 that maybe that version of the left was coming back and more people were reading Marx. There were like Marxist reading groups all over the place. Occupy Wall Street, for all of its problems, I think brought class rhetoric back into, if not a mainstream, at least into a sort of framework that a left could organize around. And so, when Bernie Sanders launched his campaign in 2015 and it took off in ways that probably none of us, including him, expected, it was a real moment of hope. And then you see the sort of blossoming of DSA in terms of its numbers. And you're thinking, okay, maybe we're getting somewhere. Maybe there is a sort of socialist-based or Marxist-based left to be organized in the U.S., even though still small. I don't know where we're at now. So, I teach college students, many of them every year. So people in their late teens and early 20s, and they're very, very amenable to what I would consider sort of Marxist leaning arguments. There's nothing about capitalism that most of them, and this might be a self-selecting group, but like that is history majors, humanities majors at a public university in the Midwest. But most of them are utterly convinced that the system sucks.
Even the conservatives here in Utah tend to be way more anti-capitalist than I would expect.
Yeah, I think there is resonance for anti-capitalism, but there is a lot of pessimism and cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
We're definitely in a moment like, is there a way out? Mark Fisher's argument that it's easier to imagine an end to the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, I think is still true.
Yeah, although I think maybe it's modified by. Did you read the Critique of Techno of Techno-Feudal Reason by Eugenie Morozov?
No.
But he says right now it feels like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the continuance of capitalism, but we can't imagine anything better either.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, so I don't know. We're in a weird moment, and I don't have any sort of genius answers as to what is to be done, except we have to, for me, continue to sort of write and think and teach in ways that might give people alternative ideas about what the future could look like. And for those inclined, get out there and organize.
Okay. I think I can hear that you sound different than you sounded 2 years ago. I listened to your show, Trotsky and the Chrysanthemum, which is no longer going on, I believe. But you sounded not optimistic at all, but more that the realities of post-COVID capitalism had even shown centrist flakes like Joe Biden that we were in a moment that it moved beyond that. I get the feeling from your answer now that you don't still feel that way.
No, it's yet another instance of, damn it, I should have known better. The system always seems to find a way to save itself and move forward. I feel like that's what we're going through right now.
Yeah, I feel like the moment I saw more than sectional inflation, I was like, shit. I'm like, well, we're back to the 70s, so here we go again. But yeah, I find it interesting right now because I agree with you. We still live in a moment of broadly anti-capitalist sentiment, I think, but I don't know that it's a left-wing moment yet. And I think it's largely undecided.
I think it's so. I agree with you. I think that's why it's so important for those of us who are left-wing anti-capitalists to do our best to talk to as many different people as possible in as many different fora as possible about how a left-wing response to capitalism and sort of a left-wing channeling of anti-capitalism would be so much better than the alternative.
Right. I mean, I am often, I think a wake-up moment for me was watching Josh Harley write an article on Compact that was like making better stances on workers than some of the people in TSA. And I was like, oh, we're in trouble. We're like, this is the, because these moments, I mean, the last time of really big anti-capitalist sentiment like this was the 30s. And I don't need to tell people like how that went. Like,
yeah, if the right, and I don't see it happening because they're too deeply embedded with the capitalism, but if the American right ditched its support for neoliberalism it could be unstoppable.
Right. This is one of the fears. This is one of the fears that people had about Trump that I didn't, but that I was like, Trump is dangerous, I guess, in a real sense, but he has not. I don't think his paleo conservatives are going to be willing to completely buck neoliberalism, um, and he'll probably turn back to different elements of the Republican establishment to reestablish that. And until the end of COVID, that is exactly what he did. COVID
Yes.
things got wild, but
Yeah.
I think it got wild for everybody. But it is in this interesting moment where I feel like as a leftist, I'm now not just tasked to argue against capitalism, but also tasked to argue against other kinds of anti-capitalism, some of which I think may even be worse than capitalism. It's like,
It's true, but you're in good company because Marx spent as much time arguing against other forms of not capitalism than he did with capitalists.
I mean, honestly, capital is about capitalism, obviously. I mean, I take Hal Draper's early work that Marx was working on this massive bourgeois society project and realized how massive just the economic part of it was. But most of the political writings are not aimed at capitalists because he just doesn't need to. I mean, it's one of the things about the circular firing squad nature of the left that I think people rightly disclaim that we're often not unified when we need to be. But I'm also like, yeah, but we do have a tradition. In fact, the founders of our tradition are based on us calling each other out when we're wrong. Like, and I'm not saying that's like Marx was always right. There's some things Marx says that I think don't actually hold. And anyone who's read tons of Marx, as will find that he changes his opinion and contradicts himself in ways that aren't even systemizable. So like the Althusserian like epistemic break, not really that explanatory. He changed his ideas based on stuff he saw on the ground. There's no like grand shift in methodology or anything, but there are major changes. I mean, my favorite one is his prediction of the end of capitalism in 1855, which obviously did not happen. No. So, but I think this is important to talk about. My last question, and I think this is going to be a little bit more. You have not talked about your political beliefs. I happen to know you associated yourself with Trotskyism for a good portion of your life. Would you still say that you do?
No, I never associated with Trotskyism. We called our podcast Trotsky and the Wild Orchids because there's a famous Richard Rorty article by that title in which he makes the case he grew up, I think, in a Trotskyist-ish family, and he makes the argument you can talk about politics and culture and they don't have to be related. It was just a play on that. I've always been, at least since I was in my early 20s, Marxist on the left, not really affiliating with any one particular strain. Trotskyism, to me, I don't understand the point of it since
it's my stance too. It's
not of Stalin, to be honest with you.
I mean, it barely makes sense after 1952, and which is why it splits in so many wild directions, right? Because you have people who are Soviet defensists, people who are like campus for NATO. I mean, you get all kinds of wild stuff. But after 1992, I definitely don't understand. I get a kind of Marxist internal critique of the Soviet Union that isn't. Wouldn't it be cool if the Soviet Union was more Stalinist than it is? Which is the other critique.
You don't have to be a Trotskyist to be critical of the history of the Soviet Union, especially now. But so it's true that most people who are on the left, on the Marxist left, critical of the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s were Trotskyists. But I don't see the point of Trotskyism since then, really.
Right. It's it's an interesting sectarian like hangover. I was going to ask you then. That actually answers my question in some ways. What
Yeah.
have you made of its like seeming precipitous decline in the last 20 years? Because what was interesting, I think, when you and I were encountering Marxism, if you were a Marxist, if you met a Marxist group, even if it was a pro-Stalin Marxist group, which is weird. If I was to list them, almost all of them were Trotskyist. Like they're the exceptions were the RCP and the CPUSA, right?
Yeah.
Now that's just not true. It seems like those Trotskyist organizations are declining rapidly. A lot of them have just entered the DSA, which to some degree makes sense. A lot of them have broken apart after various sex scandals because of the way that they run their organizations, which sadly is also kind of predictable. But I was going to ask you, like, do you think it's good or bad that a lot of these, like, we do still have Marxist Leninists, I guess, although I don't encounter lots of them, and they do seem to be disproportionately on the internet. That we don't have the same kind of sectarian left that we had when I was encountering the left, and I think that's a mixed blessing. I think it's probably more good than bad. However, it does mean that like a lot of people who are like, vaguely socialistly inclined don't have an organization that really educates them in any coherent and systemic way about how to think about that. Now, like I said, a lot of the sectarian ways of educating people, while coherent and systemic, were often like deeply alienating and sometimes just out and out wrong. But it was a kind of systemic way to approach it. And I do feel like that may be lacking in the current, like, broadly socialist left in the United States right now.
Yeah, I mean, if there was something to be said for Trotskyism, at least in an American context, I think this is true internationally as well, was some of the best left-wing intellectuals were Trotskyists because they truly believed in, I guess, political education to a pretty extensive degree. And so if there was a sort of mechanism for developing that now, we could use it. But Trotskyism itself, to me, is just a holdover of the Cold War. I don't know why any young person would want to join a Trotsky. Like, what would be the motivation to join a Trotskyist organization if you were like a 20-year-old left winger? I don't understand it. We need probably party organization that will serve not just as a political organizing mechanism, but also educational. But why that would need to be Trotskyist, I don't really understand.
No, I don't. I tend to be in the Cold War battles. I tend to side with the defensist end of Trotskyism on a lot of questions. But I also tend to. I'm like you. After 1992, I'm like, well, what? Like, the Soviet Union's fallen. What are we debating about this for anymore? Like, it's not. I guess we could have these debates around China, but even those debates are like the debates between different kinds of Maoists about Dungism or not. That's a slightly more live question, but barely. Like,
the reason to be a Trotskyist at one point was because you could be a Marxist on the left and anti-Stalinist, but
right.
There's
right. I mean, it's not like Stalinism is like it does exist. It actually is the one tendency that's made kind of a comeback. Although, as I pointed out, the Trotskyists to piss them off, if I took Maoist, Marxist, Leninist, organizations and mapped out their positions, and I mapped out the positions of all the Trotskyist organizations, I'd find corresponding organizations on each side that actually agree more with each other on anything contemporary than they do at other people calling themselves Marxist, Leninist, or Trotskyist, or Leninist, the way they would call themselves, whatever. And I think that's kind of damning of the whole enterprise. I'm like, yeah, these debates are not as live anymore. I mean, um, like I occasionally point out, like the difference between Marxist-Leninist Maoism and Marxist-Leninism is like how you feel about peasants. Do you see any peasants?
Yeah.
I mean, it might be a live question in like India where there are still large, peasant populations, but where we live, it's just not relevant. Then I like you too. I tend to be more of I am a Marxist without adjectives, and I'll call them like I see them. And I think most of the isms, including Stalinism, end up looking pretty bad historically. But even Stalin wrote occasionally smart things. Like it's like we have to deal with all these. I'd rather deal with what they said and did, than like what tendency I affiliate with. And I think that's good. But and then, like I said at the beginning, I think it's still actually a good thing that the sectarian tendencies are kind of dying away. But I don't think the DSA has been living up to this task on educating people in a systemic way, because it's a compromise between different groups who don't actually share a political program or vision in a lot of ways. And I think that's and it's also, while super massive for the American left, I mean, I will totally admit 95,000 people at the high end, 70,000 people at the low end is not anything to sneeze at.
Yeah.
It's also in a country of 350 million, not mass.
No.
So, we do have to keep that in perspective. I remember somebody comparing the DSA to Tea Party Trumpists, and I'm like, there's an order of while there are probably more generic liberals in the United States than conservatives, I think most polls bear that out. Even if they're systemically kind of in the wrong places to matter the most for national voting. There's still an order of magnitude more reactionaries than there are DSAers.
Oh yeah,
it's like
it's not even close.
So I sometimes I have to remind people of that, because we're coming from a, like I said, I'm in my early 40s, you're 50. We remember the left when like the largest group was 6,000 people. And when looking at the DSA, which is bigger than all those groups in the 80s and 90s combined, it can feel so huge. But then I just have to remind myself of like the size of the country and the size of the world. Yep. And then it's a completely different conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have anything you want to say in closing?
No, I had fun talking to you. Let's do this definitely again when my book's out. That would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I would love to have you back on when the book's out. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Bye-bye.